My name is Annie Reed. I am 34 years old. And for 11 years my family told everyone I cleaned houses for a living. Not that I ran a business. Not that I managed properties. Not that I had built something from the ground up with nothing but early mornings, calloused hands, and a stubbornness my mother called a character flaw and I called survival. No. They told people I was a maid. At every family gathering, every Sunday dinner, every holiday table set with my grandmother's china in Greenwich, Connecticut, my mother would smile at the neighbors and say it the same way every single time. Annie, oh, she cleans houses. Said it like she was reporting the weather. Mild disappointment, partly cloudy, no chance of improvement. And my sister Trina, 3 years older, MBA from NYU, senior financial analyst at a firm in Stamford, would sit across the table with that particular smile she reserved for moments when being the favorite required absolutely no effort at all. He did not have to say a word. My mother's introduction said everything Trina needed it to say. But there is something my family did not know. Something that had been sitting in the Fairfield County Public Records for 3 years, filed under an LLC name, attached to a property assessed at $5.6 million. And the night Trina found it, 2 days before Thanksgiving, sitting in her car in my parents' driveway with her phone screen glowing against the dark, was the night 11 years of silence finally had somewhere to land. Before I take you all the way back to where this started, I want to say something first. If this story is already sitting somewhere familiar in your chest, please take a second to subscribe and leave a like. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back. 11 years back to a Tuesday night in October when I sat at my mother's kitchen table in Greenwich and told her I was dropping out of the business administration program at the University of Connecticut. She had just poured herself a cup of chamomile tea. She set the kettle down so carefully it made no sound. She looked at me the way you look at a check that has just bounced. Disbelief first. Then the slow, quiet calculation of exactly how much this is going to cost. Her name is Dorothy Reed. She is 61 years old now. But back then she was 50, sharp-eyed, and entirely certain that the path she had mapped for her daughters was the only one worth walking. She had raised us alone after my father Raymond walked out when I was 9 and Trina was 12. She had worked as an office manager at a law firm in downtown Greenwich for 20 years straight. She believed in titles. She believed in business cards. She believed that a woman's security lived inside her job description and nowhere else. So when I told her I was leaving Yukon to start a residential cleaning company, she did not yell. Dorothy Reed did not yell. She went very still. She picked up her chamomile tea, took one slow sip and said, "You want to clean other people's houses." I told her it was not just cleaning. I told her I had done the research, that there was a gap in the market in Fairfield County for high-end residential cleaning services, that the startup costs were low, that I had already lined up 2 clients through a neighbor who had referred me. He heard none of it. You have 1 year of college left, Annie. 1 year. And you want to throw that away to scrub other people's toilets. Trina was in the living room during this conversation. She was always in the living room during these conversations. Just close enough to hear everything and just far enough to claim she had not been listening. He did not come in. She did not say a word in my defense. But when I walked past her on the way to my room, she looked up from her laptop and gave me a small, careful smile. Not unkind exactly. More like the smile of someone who has just been handed something they did not have to ask for. Because starting that night the comparison would never be difficult again. Trina was the daughter with a future. I was the one who cleaned up after other people. I moved out 2 weeks later. Rented a studio apartment on the east side of Stamford, 12 minutes from Greenwich, far enough to breathe. I registered my business, Reed Residential Services, as a sole proprietorship. I bought supplies with the last of my savings, $240 on cleaning products, microfiber cloths, and a commercial-grade vacuum. I carried up 3 flights of stairs myself because I could not afford the delivery fee. My first real client was a woman named Helen Marsh. She lived in a 6-bedroom colonial on Derry Road in Greenwich, 10 minutes from my mother's house. She found me through a flyer I had posted at the dry cleaner on Greenwich Avenue. She called on a Wednesday and by Friday I was on my hands and knees scrubbing her kitchen grout with a toothbrush I had cut down to fit into the tile seams. Helen watched me work for the first 20 minutes and then disappeared upstairs. When she came back down 2 hours later, she walked through the kitchen slowly, ran one finger along the baseboard behind the refrigerator, looked at it, then looked at me. He said, "When can you come back?" I said, "Whenever you need me." He said, "Twice a week then?" and she handed me a check for $400. I held that check in my car for a full minute before I started the engine. Not because of the money, though the money mattered, but because of what it confirmed. That I had done exactly what I said I was going to do. That the research had been right. That there was a real market here and I had just walked into it through the front door. My mother's response when I told her about Helen was to ask if I was wearing a uniform. Because if I was going to do this, she said, I should at least look professional. No question about the client. No question about the rate or what the work felt like or whether I was okay. Just, are you wearing a uniform? I told her I had polo shirts with the company name embroidered on the chest. She nodded once. That is something at least, she said. Then she changed the subject to Trina's upcoming performance review at the firm. The first year was brutal in the way that first years always are. I worked 6 days a week. I had 7 regular clients by month 4, 12 by month 8. And by the end of year 1 I had brought in just over $60,000 in revenue running the entire operation by myself. I cleaned every house with my own hands. I answered every call. I did my own bookkeeping on a spreadsheet I built from a YouTube tutorial at 11 o'clock at night with a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside me. Christmas that year. My mother's dining room in Greenwich. The long table, the good china, the candles that were never lit until guests arrived. My Aunt Patricia was there with her husband Lou. My cousin Greta, who worked in pharmaceutical sales in Boston. And 2 of my mother's friends from the law firm, Beverly and Jan, who had been coming to these dinners since before I could remember. Trina sat to my mother's right. I sat at the far end near the kitchen because I had offered to help serve. Dorothy stood at the head of the table and did what she always did. She introduced her daughters. She told everyone about Trina's year-end review, the client portfolio she was managing, the networking dinner she had attended in the city the previous week. Everyone applauded. Trina smiled the smile she had been perfecting since she was 15. Then my mother turned to me with a look that carried the particular weight of an apology she had no intention of making. Annie is keeping herself busy. She does residential cleaning over in Stamford. She is building up her client list. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He enjoys it. He enjoys it. Like I was a hobby. Like I was a brief obsession with candle making or a scrapbooking phase nobody expected to last. Cousin Greta asked me one polite follow-up question. How many clients do you have? And before I could answer, Beverly from the law firm asked Trina about the commute to Stamford and the table rotated away from me like a lazy Susan that nobody bothered to stop. Aunt Patricia caught my eye from across the table. She was the only one who did not perform enthusiasm for Trina and rehearsed pity for me. She just looked at me directly, steadily and gave me a small nod. The kind that says I see exactly what is happening here and I want you to know that I see it. After dinner she found me in the kitchen while I was wrapping leftovers in foil. How is it really going, she asked. Not like a test. Like someone who actually wanted to know. I told her the truth. Slow but real. She nodded. Keep going, she said. That is all. Just keep going. She went back to the living room and I stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the dark backyard thinking about Helen Marsh's check and the toothbrush I had trimmed down to fit the grout lines, and I kept going. Year 2 I hired my first employee. Her name was Gloria Reyes, 44 years old, mother of 3, former hotel housekeeper who had worked the morning shift at a Marriott in Norwalk for 9 years before the property downsized and let her go without so much as a card. She showed up to our interview in a pressed blouse and brought a handwritten list of references on a notepad. I hired her on the spot. We worked side by side for 6 months before I trusted her to run a house alone. By month 7 I trusted her completely. Gloria was meticulous in a way that could not be taught. She cared about the work the way you only care about something when doing it well is the whole point. Gloria changed everything. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in the steady compounding way that good decisions tend to change things when you make them early enough and commit to them completely. With her handling the residential side, I had time to do something I had been turning over in my mind since the end of year 1. I started reaching out to property management companies in Fairfield County. Not to clean their units as a one-off favor. To pitch a contract. Monthly recurring service for their entire residential portfolio. One invoice, one point of contact. Consistent standards across every property every single time. The first company I approached said no without asking a single question about my work. The second said they would think about it and never called back. The third, a mid-size operation called Fairfield Premier Properties run by a man named Douglas Hale, said yes. 42 units. A contract worth $8,000 a month. I sat in my car in the parking lot after that meeting and did not move for several minutes. Then I called Aunt Patricia. She picked up on the second ring. I just signed a contract for $8,000 a month, I told her. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, Annie Reed. And she laughed, the real kind of laugh, not the polite kind people use when they do not know what else to do. The kind that means I knew it. I knew it all along. I did not call my mother that day. There was nothing she could have said that would have added anything to what that laugh already gave me. By year 3, Reed Residential Services had 14 full-time employees, 3 company vans with the logo on the side, and contracts with 4 property management firms covering over 120 units across Fairfield County. I had moved out of the studio in Stamford and into a 2-bedroom apartment in Westport, 1,200 square feet, 2nd floor, with a small balcony that looked out over a side street lined with oak trees. I bought real furniture for the first time in my life. A dining table that seated 6. A bed frame that was not from a flat-pack box. A coffee maker that cost more than my first month's cleaning supplies. My mother did not know any of this. Not the contracts, not the employees, not the vans. As far as Dorothy Reed knew, her younger daughter was still scrubbing baseboards in other people's homes, still building up that client list, still enjoying it. I had stopped offering information after year 1. Not because I wanted to be secretive, but because every time I had shared something real, something that mattered to me, she had found a way to measure it against Trina and declare it insufficient without technically saying so. So I stopped handing her the measuring tape. The family dinners continued on their predictable schedule. Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the occasional Sunday in summer when Dorothy decided the backyard was presentable enough for company. The script never changed. Trina would arrive with a bottle of wine and news about a promotion or a client win or a conference she had been invited to speak at, and my mother would receive this news like a woman collecting evidence that her sacrifices had been worth it. I would arrive, usually slightly late because I had been dealing with a scheduling issue or a supply order, and my mother would smile her careful smile and tell whoever was at the table that Annie was still doing her cleaning work, still keeping busy, still finding her way. Still finding her way. I was 30 years old. I was running a company with 14 employees and 6-figure monthly contracts, and she was telling Aunt Patricia's book club friends that I was still finding my way, like I was a college freshman who had not yet declared a major. I filed that phrase in the same place I filed all the others. Evidence. Not for confrontation. Just for clarity. So I would never make the mistake of softening what I had seen. The moment that came closest to cracking me happened on a Sunday in April of year 4. I had driven to Greenwich for one of my mother's impromptu lunches, the kind she called casual but prepared for like a military operation. The neighbors from across the street, the Callahans, had joined us. Tom Callahan was a contractor who had done work on half the houses on their block. His wife Patrice had taught elementary school for 30 years. They were decent people, genuinely warm, the kind who asked follow-up questions and meant them. Tom asked me what I was up to these days. Before I could answer, my mother appeared from the kitchen doorway with a bread basket and said, Annie manages a little cleaning operation. She said little the way you say it when you want to shrink something down to a size that fits the story you have already been telling. Tom nodded politely. Patrice asked if I had a card. I said I did not have one on me. My mother set the bread basket down and said, Trina just got promoted to senior analyst. Tom, you should hear about the project she is leading. And the table moved on. I drove home that afternoon on the Merritt Parkway with both hands on the wheel and the windows down even though it was barely 60 degrees. I needed the cold air. I needed something to push back against. Because the thing about being erased in small increments over a long period of time is that each individual erasure is too small to justify the size of what you feel. Nobody had been cruel. Nobody had shouted. My mother had simply described me inaccurately to a neighbor and redirected the conversation. And somehow that felt worse than an argument would have. At least an argument would have meant I was worth the energy. Gloria noticed something was off the next morning. She found me in the supply room reorganizing shelves that were already organized. She leaned against the doorframe and watched me for a moment. You went to your mother's, she said. It was not a question. I did not answer right away. I just kept stacking microfiber cloths in the same order I had been stacking them for 4 years. Then I said she told the neighbors I manage a little cleaning operation. Gloria was quiet. Then she said, my mother told everyone I was the hotel maid for 9 years even after I had a supervisor title. I stopped stacking. I turned around. Gloria shrugged. Some mothers need you to be smaller than them. It is not about you. It never was. She pushed off the door frame and went back to the schedule board. I stood in the supply room for another minute. Then I went to my desk and pulled up the proposal I had been drafting for a new commercial contract and finished it before noon. The proposal was for a company called Harlow Group, a real estate development firm based in Darien that was in the process of converting a former textile mill in Bridgeport into a mixed-use residential and retail property. 48 residential units, ground floor commercial space, a courtyard and a shared rooftop terrace. They needed a cleaning and maintenance partner for the entire property on a multi-year contract. I had been researching them for 3 weeks. I knew their portfolio, their timeline, their lead property manager's professional history, and the name of the contractor handling the interior build-out. When I walked into that meeting, I was not walking in as the woman who managed a little cleaning operation. I was walking in as the owner of a company that serviced over 140 units across the county with a retention rate I could put on paper and defend with numbers. They gave me the contract. 2 years renewable. $12,000 a month. I shook hands with the Harlow Group's operations director, a woman named Sandra Osei, who had the kind of firm grip that told you she had spent years in rooms where people underestimated her and had long since stopped caring. She looked at my proposal one more time after we shook hands and said, "This is thorough." I said I had good information. She smiled. "Come back when the build-out is done and we will talk about the maintenance side too." I said I would. That night I drove back to Westport and stood on my balcony with a glass of water and looked out at the oak trees and thought about the word little. Little cleaning operation. I had just signed a $12,000 a month contract with a development firm. I had 14 employees, 3 vans, and a client list that covered more square footage than most small commercial real estate agencies managed in a year. And somewhere in Greenwich my mother was probably setting the table for dinner and telling Dorothy's version of my life to whoever happened to be in the room. I let her. I had learned something important in 4 years of running a business that nobody in my family understood or inquired about. The people who needed to diminish you were not doing it because your life was small. They were doing it because yours was starting to look larger than the story they had told themselves about you, and that was a problem they could not solve by asking you a real question. So they solved it by making the language smaller. Oh, still finding her way. Enjoys it. Words like lids pressed down over something they were not ready to look at directly. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. I was not angry, I was patient. And patience, when you have something worth waiting for, is not the same thing as surrender. It is strategy. It is the long game. And I had been playing the long game since the night my mother set down her chamomile tea and told me I was throwing my life away, and every single move I had made since then had landed exactly where I intended it to. The Harlow Group contract opened a door I had not anticipated. Sandra Osei was the kind of person who collected competent people the way others collected recommendations, and 6 months after we signed our first agreement she introduced me to a man named Victor Ching at a property industry mixer in Stamford that she had casually mentioned I should attend. Victor was 53, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have already made their money and no longer need to perform for anyone. He owned a small portfolio of mixed-use commercial properties across Fairfield and New Haven counties, and he was looking for someone to handle facilities management across all of them. Not just cleaning. Scheduling, vendor coordination, move-in and move-out inspections, minor maintenance oversight. The kind of work that sat between a cleaning company and a property management firm and did not have a clean job title. I told him I could do it. I went home that night and built a service framework from scratch. Stayed up until 2 in the morning cross-referencing industry rate sheets and scope of work templates I found through a property management association I had joined 6 months earlier for exactly this kind of preparation. I sent Victor a proposal 3 days later. He called me the morning after he received it. He said, "You built this yourself?" I said yes. He said, "Most vendors send me a brochure. This reads like someone who actually understands what the problems are." We signed a contract the following week. The business restructured around that contract. I registered a new entity, Reed Property Services LLC, broader in scope than the original sole proprietorship, built to handle facilities work alongside the cleaning operation. I hired 2 more full-time staff, brought on a part-time operations coordinator named Bev Thornton who had spent 12 years at a commercial property firm in Norwalk before taking time off to care for her mother. And I moved the business out of the spare bedroom of my apartment and into a small office suite on Commerce Drive in Shelton. 900 square feet. A reception desk, 2 workstations, a conference table that seated 8, and a window that looked out over a parking lot that I found genuinely satisfying because it meant the business had an address that was not my home. Gloria came with me. Of course she did. She became my lead operations supervisor, managing the cleaning teams while I focused on the facilities contracts and the business development side. On her first day in the new office, she walked the entire space twice, straightened the chair at the reception desk, and then looked at me and said, "We need a plant in here." I told her to pick one. She came back the next day with a large pot hose in a terracotta pot and set it on the windowsill. It is still there. I want to tell you about year 6 because year 6 was when the silence became a deliberate choice rather than a default. Before year 6 I had simply stopped volunteering information. After year 6 I actively decided that my family would not know what I was building until I decided they were ready to know. And the difference between those two things matters more than it might sound. Stopping the volunteering was exhausted self-protection. The decision was something else. It was the moment I understood that what I was accumulating was not just revenue and contracts and square footage. It was evidence. A record of who I was when no one who was supposed to believe in me was watching. The dinner that hardened that decision happened in March. My mother had organized what she called a small celebration for Trina, who had been named a vice president at her firm in Stamford. The promotion was real and I did not begrudge Trina the achievement. What I begrudged was the production my mother made of it, the centerpieces, the printed menu inserts at every place setting, the way she stood at the head of the table with her wine glass and delivered a toast that lasted 4 minutes and ended with the words, "This is what I worked for." Not we. I was seated at the far end. Aunt Patricia was beside me. She reached under the table and briefly pressed my hand without looking at me. Cousin Greta was across from us, scrolling her phone under the napkin. My mother's friend Beverly from the law firm was 2 seats down, leaning forward, genuinely moved as if Trina's VP title was a thing of rare beauty. When the applause settled, my mother looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for the moments when she remembered I existed. "And Annie is doing well too," she said. "Still with the cleaning. We are proud of both our girls." The table gave me a polite murmur. Not applause. A murmur. The sound a crowd makes when someone finishes third. I raised my glass and smiled. I said thank you. I ate the salmon my mother had ordered from a caterer in Greenwich and I helped clear the plates afterward, and I drove home on the Merritt Parkway at 9:30 and sat in my parked car in the garage under my building for 6 minutes before going upstairs. Not because I was devastated. Because I was calculating. Because I was running the numbers in my head the way I ran them on spreadsheets. And the numbers were telling me that the gap between my mother's version of my life and the actual version had grown so wide that when it finally became visible it would not just surprise her. It would reorganize everything she thought she knew about the choices she had made and the daughter she had written off. I sat with that for 6 minutes. Then I went upstairs and fed my cat, a gray tabby named Pepper who had been sleeping on my keyboard since I brought her home from the shelter in year 3, and I went to bed. The property came on the market in October of year 7. I had been watching the Fairfield County commercial listings for 18 months by then, not urgently, but the way you watch for something when you know the timing has to be right and you are willing to wait for it. The listing was for a 4-story mixed-use building on Broad Street in Milford, Connecticut, 11 miles from Greenwich, 8 miles from Bridgeport. Built in 1931, originally a savings and loan institution, converted in the 1970s into office and retail space. Ground floor retail, currently occupied by a dry cleaner and an insurance agency. Second and third floors divided into professional offices. Fourth floor, a partially finished open space that had been used as storage for the previous owner for 15 years. The assessed value was $5.6 million. The asking price was $4.9. The building had good bones, original terrazzo floors in the lobby, arched windows on the second floor, a facade that had been maintained well enough to avoid costly remediation. What it needed was a real facilities operation, the kind I had been running for other people's properties for 4 years. I knew exactly what was wrong with it and exactly what it would cost to fix because I had done this work in buildings like it across 2 counties. I spent 3 weeks doing due diligence. I walked the building 4 times with Victor Ching, who had agreed to consult on the acquisition informally in exchange for first right of refusal on 2 office suites on the second floor. I hired a structural engineer, a commercial inspector, and a real estate attorney named Philip Garrett who had handled 3 of my contract negotiations and knew how I worked. I ran financing scenarios every night for 2 weeks. The SBA loan, the commercial mortgage, the reserves I had been building since year one, and a private investment from Aunt Patricia, $150,000 documented, notarized, her idea not mine, delivered over coffee at her kitchen table in Cos Cob on a Saturday morning when she slid an envelope across the table and said, "I have been waiting for the right moment to do this since year one." I did not cry in front of her. I waited until I was in my car. Then I sat there for a moment with the envelope on the passenger seat and the oak trees outside her window in my rearview mirror, and I let myself feel the full weight of being believed in by one person who had never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I was. Then I drove to Philip Garrett's office and told him to make the offer. We closed in January of year 8. The deed was filed at the New Haven County Clerk's office under Reed Property Services LLC, managing member Annie M. Reed. Assessed value $5.6 million. I stood in the empty lobby on the morning of closing with the terrazzo floors and the arched windows and the winter light coming through the glass, and I did not say anything out loud. There was nothing that needed to be said out loud. The building said it. The deed said it. The 15 employees and the 3 vans and the facilities contracts and the years of early mornings said it. I drove to the office on Commerce Drive. Gloria was at her desk. She looked up when I walked in. She read my face the way she always did, the way someone reads a room they have walked into 1,000 times and can tell immediately when something is different. He said, "You got it." I said, "We got it." She stood up from her chair, walked around the desk and hugged me without saying anything else. The pothose on the windowsill had grown 3 new vines since she brought it in. I noticed that for some reason. 3 new vines in 8 months. Some things, when you give them the right conditions and leave them alone to grow, will surprise you with how far they reach. My mother called that evening. She called every few weeks, always on a weekday, always around 7, always to relay news about Trina or to ask if I was coming to the next family dinner. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message about Easter. The good china, she said. She was planning to use the good china this year. Easter came and went. The good china made its appearance. My mother arranged the table with the precision she reserved for occasions where the neighbors might see through the dining room window, and she seated Trina at her right hand the way a queen seats her heir. I sat across from Cousin Greta and spent most of the meal listening to my mother describe Trina's latest project at the firm, a multi-client portfolio restructuring that apparently required Trina to work weekends and take calls during family dinners, which my mother framed not as an inconvenience but as evidence of indispensability. "She is just that essential to them," Dorothy said, refilling her wine glass. "They simply cannot move forward without her input." Trina looked up from her phone long enough to smile modestly and then looked back down. I noticed something that afternoon that I had not paid close attention to before. Trina was tired. Not physically tired, though that too, but tired in the particular way of someone who has been performing at a level they can barely sustain for an audience that has no idea how much it costs. The polished answers came a half-second slower than they used to. The corporate smile flickered once, briefly, when my mother mentioned the weekend calls. A crack so small that nobody else at the table would have caught it. But I had been watching my sister's performance for 34 years and I knew where the seams were. I did not say anything about it. I helped with the dishes after dinner, kissed my mother on the cheek at the door, drove back to Westport on the Merritt Parkway with the windows up this time. The crack in Trina's performance was not my business. I had enough of my own business to attend to, specifically the 4th floor of the building on Broad Street in Milford, which I had spent the first 3 months of ownership converting from a storage graveyard into something I had been designing in my head since the day I first walked through it. The 4th floor renovation took 5 months and cost $420,000. I used a contractor named Ed Faria who had worked with Victor Ching for 15 years. We stripped the space down to the structural elements, refinished the original hardwood subfloor hidden under 30 years of industrial carpet, installed floor-to-ceiling windows on the east and south walls, put in a small kitchen along the north wall, added a private bathroom and a storage room. When it was done, it was the kind of space that made people stop in the doorway and recalibrate whatever they had been expecting. I moved Reed Property Services into the 4th floor in June and the Commerce Drive office went on sublease the same week. Moving the business into the building I owned eliminated a rent expense and put my operations team inside the property I was managing. It was also the moment the building stopped being an asset on a spreadsheet and became something I moved through every day. I knew every stairwell, every electrical panel, every tenant by name and lease renewal date. The dry cleaner on the ground floor was run by a woman named Mei Sung who had been in that space for 14 years. The insurance agency next door was operated by a man named Frank DeLuca who brought Italian cookies to the office on the first of every month without fail or explanation. The upper floors held a small accountant, a family law attorney, a physical therapist, and a two-person architecture studio whose principals were so quiet I sometimes had to check the lease to confirm they were still there. These were my people. Not in the way my family was supposed to be my people and never quite managed it. In the way that people become yours when they show up consistently and do not require you to be anything other than the person who keeps things running. The group text arrived on a Thursday in September. It came from cousin Greta, forwarded to me from what was supposed to be a thread between her and my mother and Trina. She had meant to send it to her friend Diane. Alphabetical contacts. Diane. Read Greta. Read Annie. Same opening letter, 2 names apart in the contact list. I was sitting at my desk on the 4th floor when my phone buzzed. Pepper was asleep on the corner of my desk. The terrazzo lobby 3 floors below was quiet. The thread was from 2 days earlier. My mother had started it. Thanksgiving planning, she had written at the top. Then do you think we should invite Annie this year or keep it small? Trina had replied, Mom, she is family, of course invite her. My mother had written back, I know, I just mean the Hendersons are coming, and last year Beverly asked me what Annie does and I had to explain the whole cleaning thing and it was just awkward. Trina, just tell them she runs a small business. My mother, I suppose. It just always leads to follow-up questions and then I have to compare it to what you do and it never comes out well for her. Trina had sent a laughing emoji. Then Mom, you are terrible. My mother, I am not terrible, I am honest. There is a difference. I read the thread twice. I did not read it a third time. I set my phone face down on the desk and looked at the east wall windows and the gray September sky outside them. Never comes out well for her. My mother was not saying my life was bad. She was saying that when she held it up next to Trina's in conversation, in front of the Hendersons, in front of Beverly from the law firm, in front of anyone whose opinion she cared about, it did not reflect well on Dorothy Reed's legacy as a mother. My failure in her framing was not that I was struggling. It was that I was not succeeding in a way she could display. I picked up my phone. I saved the screenshot. I created a folder and labeled it for when I need to remember clearly. Then I put the phone in my desk drawer and went downstairs to check on a heating issue that Frank DeLuca had reported in the insurance office. The boiler was fine. A vent had come loose. I fixed it myself with a screwdriver I kept in the maintenance cabinet in the basement. It took 4 minutes. I went to Thanksgiving. I sat at the adults' table. My mother had set it beautifully, cream linen, the good china, a centerpiece of dried eucalyptus and orange slices that she had seen on a design website and reproduced faithfully. The Hendersons were there. Beverly was there. Aunt Patricia was seated beside me and she squeezed my elbow when I sat down in the way that told me she knew more about the group text situation than she was saying. I did not ask how. I did not need to. My mother introduced everyone with her usual choreography. When she got to Trina, she mentioned the VP title, the portfolio, the fact that the firm had asked her to lead a client strategy session in Boston the following month. Applause. Then she looked at me and said, and Annie is busy as always with her properties and her business. She used the word properties. She had never used that word before. She had always said cleaning, always said small, always said little or enjoys it or finding her way. Properties was new. I did not react. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip and watched Beverly from the law firm nod with what appeared to be genuine interest. Properties, Beverly said. What kind of properties? Commercial, I said. Mixed use. We are based in Milford. Beverly nodded again. That is a good market right now. I said it is. And then my mother, sensing that the conversation had turned a direction she had not planned for, reached across the table for the bread basket and said, Tom, did Dorothy tell you Trina is going to Boston next month? And the table rotated the way it always did. But this time Aunt Patricia leaned close to me and said very quietly, she said properties. I said I noticed. Aunt Patricia picked up her fork. Progress, she said, like someone marking a point on a long map. What happened to Trina over the following 2 months was not something I engineered and not something I celebrated. The restructuring at her firm in Stamford had been building quietly for most of the year and in November it arrived fully formed. Her division was folded into another team. Her VP title was eliminated in the reorganization. She was offered a senior analyst role, 2 levels below where she had been in a department she had never worked in. She declined it. She was out by the end of the month. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening. Not to relay news about Trina. to ask if I knew anyone who was hiring. Her voice had a quality I had not heard before, thin and slightly careful, like someone trying to hold a container steady while something shifted inside it. I gave her 2 names, a contact at a financial services firm in Greenwich that Victor Ching had introduced me to, and Sandra Osei, who I texted in advance to give her context. I did not make a production of it. I gave her the names and told her to have Trina reach out directly and use my name. My mother said thank you in a voice that carried 11 years of assumptions cracking very slowly along the edges. I said of course. Then I asked about the building on Broad Street. She asked me what building. I said the one I own. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, I did not know you owned a building. I said there is a lot you did not know, Mom. Kept my voice even. No edge in it. Just the plain, patient truth. She did not respond to that right away. I could hear her breathing on the line. Then she said maybe we should have dinner sometime. Just the 2 of us. I said I would check my calendar and get back to her. I meant it. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Trina sat in my parents' driveway in Greenwich with her laptop open on the passenger seat and a coffee going cold in the cup holder. She had been job hunting for 11 months. She had interviews at firms in Stamford, New Haven, and one in Hartford she had driven to in a snowstorm because she needed the wind badly enough to risk the roads. None had become offers. The market was tight. Her title history was senior enough to price her out of mid-level roles and not senior enough to land the executive ones. And the confidence that had carried her through 15 years of corporate climbing was faltering in ways she had no prior experience managing. She told me all of this later. At the time I did not know she was sitting in that car. I was on the 4th floor reviewing December lease renewals. A cup of coffee from the Nguyen sandwich shop on the ground floor on my desk. Pepper asleep on the radiator cover, the building doing its quiet Tuesday hum. Trina told me she had not planned to search my name. She had been looking up commercial real estate trends in Fairfield County for a job application, something about demonstrating market awareness, and the Broad Street building had come up in a county development report she found through Google. The report referenced Reed Property Services LLC as the managing entity. She said she stared at the name for a moment without connecting it. Then she typed it into the search bar. The first result was my business website, clean and professional, with a property portfolio page listing the Broad Street building, the facilities contracts, and a brief company history. The second result was a profile piece the Milford Mirror had run 6 months earlier. The headline read, From Service Contracts to Property Ownership, Reed Property Services marks 5 years in Milford. My photo was in the piece. My name was in the headline. The third result was the New Haven County Clerk Property Records. Reed Property Services LLC, Managing Member Annie M. Reed, assessed value $5.6 million. Trina called my mother from the driveway. It was 8:47 in the evening. Dorothy, Trina said, I need you to look something up. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has just had a belief they did not know they were carrying removed from underneath them without warning. Type Annie Reed Milford, Connecticut into Google and tell me what you see. I was locking the 4th floor office when my phone began. 3 calls from Trina in 4 minutes, then 2 from my mother, then a text from my father Raymond, which almost never happened, which said simply, Annie, call me when you can. I stood in the hallway and looked at my phone for a long moment. Then I put it in my jacket pocket, went back inside and finished the lease review. It took 22 minutes. Then I fed Pepper, turned off the lights, and went downstairs to make sure the lobby door was locked properly. At 9:43 the intercom buzzed. I had been expecting something like this for 3 years. Not exactly this, not these specific people on this specific November night, but the moment itself, the arrival of the reckoning I had been quietly preparing for since the day I signed the deed. I looked at the security monitor. 3 figures on the Broad Street sidewalk under the amber glow of the streetlight. My mother in her dark green winter coat, the one she wore to every important occasion because she believed it projected authority. Trina beside her, still in the blazer from what I assumed was another interview that day. And my father Raymond, who had driven up from Bridgeport where he had been living for 8 years, which told me someone had called him on the way and he had come without being asked twice. I pressed the intercom button. Annie. My mother's voice had something in it I had never heard before. Not anger. Not the careful performance of disappointment she had refined over 34 years. Something raw. Something that had not been edited yet. Annie, please open the door. I took my hand off the button and looked at the 3 of them on the monitor for 8 full seconds. Then I pressed it again. What do you want? Not a question. A position. My mother said, we want to understand. I said, you have had 11 years to understand. You spent them telling people I was a maid. Nobody on the sidewalk moved. Then Trina stepped toward the intercom. Her voice was quiet. Annie, I found the deed. I know what you built. Please just let us in. 7 seconds. I counted them. Then I unlocked the door. The cold night air and my mother's perfume entered the lobby at the same time. She stepped inside and stopped. Her eyes went to the terrazzo floors, the restored plasterwork, the brass light fixtures, the tenant directory beside the elevator with 4 businesses listed and Reed Property Services LLC at the top. She read it slowly. Then she looked at me. I gave them the full tour. I walked them through the ground floor retail spaces first. Mei Sung's dry cleaner was dark but visible through the glass, garments lined up in their plastic sleeves. Frank DeLuca's insurance office had a small holiday wreath on the door. The Nguyen's sandwich shop had tomorrow's specials already chalked on the board in the window. I took them up the stairs instead of the elevator because I wanted them to feel the building under their feet, the solidity of something that had been standing since 1931 and would be standing long after this conversation was finished. 2nd and 3rd floors. Professional offices, dark at this hour but fully occupied, representing $2.5 million in contracted annual revenue. My father stopped in the hallway in front of the framed Milford Mirror article. He read it without speaking. I watched my mother's eyes move across the headline to my photograph, to the assessed value in the 3rd paragraph. $5.6 million. Her face did something I had not seen it do in 34 years. It went completely still. Not the managed stillness she performed at dinner tables. The other kind. The kind that comes when the narrative is gone. 4th floor. I unlocked the office and turned on the lights. The hardwood floors, the south wall windows with the Milford streetscape below, the framed deed on the wall. Reed Property Services LLC, managing member Annie M. Reed, assessed value $5.6 million. Black ink on cream paper behind museum glass. Beside it, framed in a matching black frame, the original Reed Residential Services polo shirt. The one I had been wearing the day my mother told the Callahans I managed a little cleaning operation. I had folded it and framed it the week I signed the deed. Not as a trophy. As a record. My mother stood in front of the framed polo for a long time. Longer than she stood in front of the deed. Then she said, "Why did you not tell us?" Her voice had the quality of something breaking slowly. I sat on the edge of my desk with my arms crossed. Because every time I told you something real I said you held it up next to Trina and called it small. You called me a maid in front of the Hendersons for 11 years. You texted Trina about whether it was worth inviting me to Thanksgiving because I was awkward to explain. She flinched at that last one. She had not known I had seen the text. I let the silence hold it. Raymond stepped forward. He had not spoken since the lobby. He looked at the deed, at the polo, at his daughter sitting on the edge of her desk in a building worth more than every decision he had ever walked away from. He said, "I owe you more than an apology can cover. I know that. But I am sorry, Annie. I was not there and you built this anyway and I am sorry." I looked at my father for a long moment. "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said. "I'm not asking for anything to be undone. But what you see in this room did not happen in spite of what you put me through. It happened because I stopped waiting for your permission to be worth something. You can come to the building. You can eat downstairs. You can tell the Hendersons whatever you want. But that polo stays on the wall. Because that is where this started and I am not embarrassed by where I started. Not anymore." Trina had not spoken since the lobby. She was standing near the south windows looking out at the Milford streetscape below. She turned around and looked at me and said, "I should have stood up for you. Every single time and I did not." "I know that." I said, "I know you know." She nodded once and looked back out the window. My mother pressed her hand over her mouth. The tears came. Not the managed kind she deployed at dinner tables. The other kind. I did not move toward her. I did not move away. I let her feel the full weight of 11 years arriving in one room on one November night, and I gave her the space to hold it without helping her put it down before she was ready. I walked them to the front door at 11:15. The sidewalk was empty and cold. My mother turned back once and said, "I did not know." I said, "I know you did not. That was always the point." She walked out. I locked the door and stood in the lobby alone for a moment, for stories of something I had built rising above my head into the dark. Then I went upstairs, told Pepper she had slept through the most important night of 11 years, and made myself a cup of tea. 2 years and 3 months later. Not a round number. Not a clean anniversary. 2 years and 3 months, because that is exactly how long it took for the life I had been building in private to stop feeling like a secret and start feeling like simply the life I lived. Long enough for the people who had stood on a November sidewalk staring up at a building they had driven past 100 times to stop being visitors in my world and start being something closer to participants in it. Not fully. Not without friction. But closer. And closer after 11 years of nothing was worth something. Here is what 2 years and 3 months looks like from where I am standing. The building on Broad Street has a 5th tenant now. The ground floor space that sat vacant for 2 years while I waited for the right fit signed a lease in March with a woman named Cecile Fontaine, 41 years old, formerly a pastry chef at a hotel in New Haven who had spent 3 years saving every dollar she could and testing recipes in her apartment kitchen until she had a menu worth betting on. She opens at 6 Tuesday through Sunday. Laminated pastries, single-origin drip coffee, one rotating seasonal item on the chalkboard that she will not tell anyone about in advance. The line forms before she unlocks the door. Frank DeLuca from the insurance office has quietly retired his monthly cookie box and now brings Cecile's cardamom rolls to every meeting instead. He has not acknowledged this transition out loud and I have not pointed it out. Some shifts are better honored in silence. Gloria is now Director of Operations. The title was her idea and I gave it to her without hesitation because she had been doing the job for 3 years under a description that did not come close to covering it. She manages a team of 23, oversees every facilities contract in the portfolio, and still straightens the chair at the reception desk every morning when she walks in. The pot hose she brought in that first day has been repotted 3 times. It is currently the size of a small weather system and I refuse to move it. Bev Thornton runs the commercial side independently now, which freed me to focus on what I had been thinking about since the year after closing, expanding the portfolio. We acquired a second property in February, a 3-story mixed-use building on River Street in Shelton, 8 minutes from Broad Street, assessed at $2.1 million, in need of exactly the kind of facilities overhaul I had spent years doing for other people's buildings. The renovation is ongoing. Victor Ching consulted again. Philip Garrett handled the legal work again. Aunt Patricia did not invest this time, not because I did not ask but because she said, "You do not need me anymore, Annie," and the way she said it was not a withdrawal. It was a graduation. The deed on the wall has a companion now. Framed beside it is the purchase agreement for the Shelton property, the 2 documents side by side on the same wall where the polo shirt hangs. 3 things that tell the whole story without a single word of explanation. Where I started. What I built. Where I went next. I added a small brass label beneath the polo shirt last spring, the kind you see in museums under artifacts that require context. It reads, "Read Residential Services, Year 1. That is all. That is enough. Now let me tell you about the people. Aunt Patricia retired from her part-time bookkeeping work in the fall and started a kitchen garden in the backyard of her house in Cos Cob that has, by her own description, gotten completely out of hand. She brings me tomatoes in the summer and squash in the fall and sits in my office drinking Cecile's coffee and tells me what she thinks about everything I am working on with the particular frankness of someone who has earned the right to say exactly what she means. She is the only person in my life who has never required any version of me other than the real one. I do not take that lightly. I never will. Raymond comes on the first Sunday of every month without fail. We eat at Cecile's or upstairs in the office and we talk about ordinary things, the building, baseball, his garden in Bridgeport which started as 3 tomato plants and has become, in his words, a situation. We have never sat down and formally processed the 11 years he was absent. I do not think we will. What we have instead is the accumulation of first Sundays, 27 of them now, a quiet and consistent proof of presence that is doing the work that words would only complicate. On his 3rd visit he brought me a small succulent for my desk. He said it looked like it could take care of itself. He meant more than the plant and we both knew it. It is still on the corner of my desk and it has never once needed anything I was not able to give it. Trina is 14 months into a director role at a non-profit financial literacy organization in Bridgeport. Free counseling for first-generation college students and working families across Fairfield County. The salary is a fraction of what she made as VP. She has never once suggested she made the wrong call. She told me a few months ago that for the first time in her career the work is the point, not the title or the review cycle or how it looks from the outside. She sounded lighter when she said it, in a way I recognized from years ago, standing in Helen Marsh's kitchen with a $400 check and the satisfaction of a thing done well for its own sake. We are not the sisters we should have been for the first 2 decades of our lives. But we are becoming something real, and real is the only foundation worth building on. My mother is the last chapter and the longest one, and I will give it to you straight. Dorothy Reed is a different woman in some ways and the same woman in others, and I have made my peace with both of those things being true at once. She comes to the building on the second Tuesday of every month. She sits at Cecile's for an hour with a coffee and whatever book she is reading as part of the neighborhood book club she joined last spring, for women from the Milford area who meet at the library on the third Thursday of every month and take their reading seriously enough that my mother, who has strong opinions about narrative structure, fits in immediately. Sometimes she comes upstairs after and sometimes she does not. When she does, we talk about real things. Not performances, not comparisons, not the Hendersons. Real things. She told me something on her 6th visit that I have thought about many times since. She was sitting across from my desk looking at the polo shirt on the wall, and she said, "My mother told me once that girls like us did not get to want things, we only got to manage things." And I believed her for too long, and I passed it on without knowing I was passing it on. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I know, Mom. And I think that is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." She looked at her hands. "I hope it is not the last one," she said. I said, "It does not have to be. She has not told the Hendersons everything." She told Beverly from the law firm, who sent a brief email to my business address that said simply, "I had no idea. I am glad you built what you built." My mother told her church group that her younger daughter owns commercial property in Milford and runs a property services company with over 20 employees. She said it standing in the parking lot after Sunday service without an apology in her voice. Aunt Patricia forwarded me the text she received about it with no comment other than a single period. Which from Aunt Patricia meant everything. The question people ask when they hear this story is whether I would do it the same way again. Whether the silence was worth it. 11 years of letting them believe what they chose to believe while I built something real in a county where nobody who was supposed to love me ever thought to look. I think about it in the early mornings when I unlock the building and walk the floors before anyone else arrives. The terrazzo lobby. The stairwell. The sound of the building settling into the day. I think about Gloria straightening the reception chair. About Frank DeLuca's cookies giving way to cardamom rolls. About Raymond's succulent on my desk and Trina sounding lighter on the phone and my mother standing in a church parking lot saying the word property without apology for the first time in 34 years. I did not stay silent to win anything. I stayed silent because I needed to know who I was when the only person watching was me. That is the only honest reason, and I will stand behind it. The building does not care who believed in me before the deed was signed. The work was always the proof. It still is. It always will be. The polo shirt is on the wall and it is staying there. Not as a reminder of where I came from. As proof that where you come from is never the thing that decides where you end up. You decide that. Every early morning, every proposal sent, every contract signed, every floor walked before the day begins. You decide it and you keep deciding it until the building is yours and the deed is framed, and the only voice left that needs to tell you what you are worth is the one that has been telling you the truth the whole time. Yours. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confront Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.